Welcome to Cross Currents, where ASRA network members get together in conversation to explore dynamics, disruptions, and discoveries shaping our world. ASRA is an independent initiative home to 90 plus network members that aims to mainstream systemic risk in policy and decision making in response to the current and future challenges. This series is entirely member driven. Network members identify the pressing issues in systemic risk and connect to colleagues to explore them more deeply. The views you'll hear are those of the participants and don't necessarily reflect ASRA's institutional positions. So I'm Phil Tovey, I'm the Director of Nature-Centric Approaches at ASRA, and I'm excited to be here today with Professor Vishwas Satgar, Wish University Johannesburg, and Rachel Ainsworth, Research Director for Societal Dynamics. And today we are going to be exploring the question, where have the animals gone in our revolutions? Rachel, Vish, you both work on issues of revolution, of big societal and system change. And Vish, I know yourself, you have worked a lot on environmental and nature-centric issues. And in ASRA, we've been exploring this topic of what it means to take a nature-centric approach to systemic risk. So today, we're going to try and explore what's really happened to all of that. Is nature something ever present? What happens when we explore a cosmological ontology to this? What are the political dynamics of our non-human kin? What happens if we accept that we as humans are part of nature? And all sorts of related issues, which we then go into consider the traditions of state revolution, power transitions, regime shifts, etc. So, Vish, maybe if I can come to you first, by all means, talk your way into this one, and what particularly stands out to you when you start to think about this question about revolutions beyond the human.
So I'm a bit, I'm a bit sort of cautious about ascribing a particular role to nature and placing more than humans, if you like, or sort of animals beyond the human into a kind of particular register that defines what they are doing. I actually think that as human beings, we can interpret, we can provide meanings to our intersections with the sort of larger life process that we inhabit. And we've been doing that in different ways. So I think that's the first point to make, in that, we've got almost 500 years of history of trying to kind of define what nature is, how we control it, how we dominate it, how we exploit it, etc. And there's a specific name for this, and it's called speciesism, and basically we haven't, over the past 500 years, dealt with this particular power structure, this particular way of thinking, and so on. And so whenever you've had kind of ruptural moments in history, in my view, whether you think in terms of 1789, the French Revolution, and I would argue it's still with us, whether you think in terms of Haiti, whether you think of the 20th century revolutions, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese, the Cuban, etc., Nicaragua. I think this question of speciesism was never a question at the heart of these revolutionary moments. And so, as a result, what we've had in these kinds of ruptural processes and moments is very, very anthropocentric thinking. The kind of registers and language we've used is, emancipation of the slave, or emancipation of the working class, or the woman's question. This has been the framing largely around how oppression has been understood. And as a result, I would argue there's been a major deficiency. But alongside this, of course, is just resistance, right, and struggle. So I would say that we've had ideologies in the kind of colonial encounter, largely indigenous ecologies. You mentioned it in your opening comment, sort of ecologies around kinship and personhood, etc. And coloniality was very much about erasing this, okay,
Mm.
and kind of reducing this to primitive, backward, etc., etc. I mean, you fast forward to the 20th century and sort of the rise of modern environmentalism. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was very, very important in kind of, spotlighting the kind of war that industrial societies and particularly industrial food systems were waging on nature. And then, of course, that grows into sort of environmental politics in the streets. It grows into green parties, etc., etc. Um, in the global south, however, I mean, these traditions of kind of indigenous ecology continued into the 20th century, constantly trying to push back, etc., etc. So I think if we are really wanting to approach this question, we've got to keep both modes of politics in mind. Ruptural, revolutionary, and their limits in how they've thought, if you like, the challenge of speciesism, but also the limits of modern environmentalism and how it's also thought speciesism. Thanks.
Thanks for those openers, Vish. Rachel, your works looked quite recently at the Syrian revolution, and do you find similar aspects to what Vish has said there, that there's been no real consideration of the species aspect within the Syrian revolution? Or did you see that appear in your research where nature is framed maybe as an environmental problem, an environmental risks feature, but the kind of absence of the animal as an individualized subject?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely fully agree with Vish. Right now, I think what we're seeing is more of the climate crisis intersecting with inequality issues. And with the Syrian revolution, I mean, it's really decades of lack of awareness and forethought, corruption, and really bad policies put in place that led to the displacement of 1.5 million people in Syria due to a 3-year-long drought. But basically, before Bashar al-Assad, Hafez al-Assad, who ran the country for almost 30 years, really incentivized farming, agriculture, and this also really depleted groundwater supplies in the region. And then so when you have constant droughts and the depletion of groundwater aquifers, it really creates this system where the water table cannot rebound in times of crisis. During that part of, that time the winter of 2006 and 7 up until 2011, there were droughts in the riverbeds of the Tigris and Euphrates River, and this also impacted, the winter rainfalls that it was coming to Syria. So, what we see with that was a problem that affected farmers, it affected livestock, and ultimately people were internally displaced, going to cities. This was compounded with an issue of not enough space, housing in the city, and it's really just these pressure points that kind of build up and build up. And again, as I said, it's really these climate issues really affecting structural scarcity, and then they're reinforcing each other. So that's what's happening in the Syrian context. But similarly, around the same time as the Arab Spring, Egypt was also very vulnerable to food shocks. You had climate change, you had drought in China, Russia, and Ukraine during that time. Egypt is one of the biggest importers of wheat, so this is also causing a lot of tension, and it created food riots that led up to the Arab Spring Revolution. Again, so it's this climate change inequality system. So I think that's what we're seeing right now is these two things merging together.
Thanks,
So
Rachel. Fish,
further,
go for it.
yeah, if I can just tack on to that, I think what Rachel has been describing also is the presence of the Earth system in
Mhm.
these particular moments, and so maybe for the purpose of our discussion, if we were to frame, if you like, the non-human animal in broad terms, if we were to think about it as the planet, as a living organism, this conversation can go in a very interesting direction. Um, because, so 500 years of coloniality, and then, of course, 150 years of rupturing the Earth system with oil, coal, and gas is literally soliciting a response from the Earth. And basically, as we know from climate science, this is dramatic. The shocks that are coming, so the droughts that were registered in Syria, etc., and other things that are coming, cyclones that have been registering, and heat waves, etc., etc. Now, while this might meet precarious social structures, like Rachel is saying, inequality ridden, and so on, what this Earth agency means is a very interesting question that we can pursue. So I'm saying if we think about this as a living organism, then the Earth is a living organism, then yes, there is a role that, if you like, more than human life is playing. It is disrupting our structures, it is loosening up power relations, it's destabilizing societies, pushing them beyond their limits, etc., etc. But I wouldn't go as far as to say that this is necessarily a revolutionary role. It is definitely contributing to change and transformation, etc. When 250 million people have been displaced over the past 10 years, and most of them in the global south through climate impacts, this is according to the UN, by the way, that's not revolutionary for me. That's sad. That's tragic. These are people that never caused the climate problem, you know. But yet again, the Earth's response is impacting disproportionately. It's inducing climate injustice, etc. So yeah, I'm just throwing that in.
Vish, can I pick up on something you said there about agency? And I wonder to both of you, how important or not is the role of agency and agents in the revolution, and revolution in the sense of I think would both of you agree that there's some system state, or stasis of the system that is going from one state to another in the active revolution, and that there are agents driving that. And I wonder if you could kind of pick up on that part and just maybe just say a little bit more about just some of the underlying theory or the assumptions that are that you are both making that are load bearing on your idea of revolution. So, does it have to have a transition from one state to another, and does that have to be driven by actors as we might think about them? And I think you know where the next question's going to go, but let's start with that first one. So, what are the underpinning assumptions in some of your ideas and theories of revolutions? In that way, Rachel, maybe you kick us off.
Um, well, are you talking about agency as in like the collaboration between? Are you trying to get at the collaboration between non-human actors and human actors in revolution? Is that what you're trying to get at?
Well,
Yeah.
for you, Rachel, let's just take Syria as one example. So there was a bunch of state actors and a bunch of non-state actors, and in a complicated mix that were trying to achieve some form of systems transformation. Um, and so, in the act of doing that, did those actors have the agency to bring around that change? Is that something that's required for a revolution, that actors can act with an agency to bring about change?
Well, yeah, for sure. And I think agency is very important. And, you know, I think when we think about revolutions, I think that, and I think Vish, they can also talk about this, is this idea of experimental risk and really trying to bring about change and agency and change, even though it might not always work out the way you intend it to. So I think that yes, agency is very important when we think about revolutions, but it's also not a given what kind of outcome you'll have. And I think that's the important part of this idea of revolution, is that you're never given any certainty. But it's about like trying in the face of uncertainty for a new type of system. And I think that was kind of what was interesting to me in Vish's work when he talks about cycles of resistance and how do you create new forms of praxis and emancipatory politics. So I don't know, maybe Vish, you can speak more on this, but I think this is also important when we talk about agency.
Yeah. So Phil, I mean, in the 20th century, I mean, the dominant kind of thinking around revolutions in political theory and revolutionary thought was largely Marxist inspired. And so, you know, Russian Revolution, as I mentioned, Chinese, etc. And there was a particular sort of conception of revolution. And Rachel's been alluding to this as well. There's been historical process that informs revolution. And within that, the kind of dominant Marxist theory was very much about a conception of consciousness. So as you resist, whether you strike, whether you kind of put up barricades, whether you build dual power, this is all about preparation. This is about building the agency. In the case of the Marxist register, the agency of the working class. In China, it was the agency of the peasant worker alliance. And you build that up, and you know, there's a vanguard party in that kind of theoretical frame, okay? A vanguard party that can provide conscious leadership, that can confront power structures at key moments, etc. Now, those conceptions of revolution, in my view, are basically problematic. I don't think they've produced emancipated societies. And the way, you know, the privileging of monopoly of power for a vanguard, the way that a particular historical subject was placed at the center of transitions, etc., very anthropocentric, if you like, very human-centered, etc. And change was basically about change for humans, okay? So that's, in my view, in summary, and might be very crude, was kind of what comes out of that legacy of 20th century revolutions. I actually think, coming back to this point about cycles of resistance and kind of a new global imaginary, I think people have been learning lessons from what has come through. This idea of, you know, monopoly of power with the vanguard, privileging the working class as subject of history, being too state-centric in how you think about change, because the process leading to what comes after marks that process. You know, so you had famines in Russia, in the Civil War under Stalin, the Great Leap Forward by Mao. You had in Pol Pot's Cambodia, I mean, complete epistemicide, okay, where you were killing off people who wore glasses, etc., because they were intellectuals, etc. So you had some very perverse kind of forms of domination and top-down kind of rationality coming out of that. And so the cycles of resistance, in my view, have been trying to unlearn that and to go back to the idea, firstly, of trying to think about agency from below. How do we empower societies to own the systemic contradictions / problems and the solutions, and how do you build capacities for that? But I think linked to this, in the context of the climate crisis, There's clearly a deep shift going on in consciousness, I think, on a planetary scale. I think biodiversity loss as well. I mean, right now, about 80% of biodiversity is largely protected on 10% of landmass, largely indigenous peoples at the front line of this. So climate, biodiversity loss, the extinction rate right now is very, very dramatic of species as well. We anywhere between 100 to 1,000 species lost per annum, so-called sixth great extinction. So I think all of these factors are prompting us to really think about who we are, how do we fit into the web of life. And I think in the cycles of resistance, there's been definitely attempts coming out of climate justice politics and moving towards earth justice, beginning to kind of recognize indigenous people's conceptions of ecology, kinship, etc., notions of natural rights, and thinking about constitutionalism differently, notions of animal welfare, etc. So there's a spectrum of thought, I think, that's coming to the fore right now in this sixth great extinction, in this moment of planetary crisis. And I'll end with this point. I think that how we got to think about agency today, I think we have to, the concept I use in my own work is this idea of forces of socio-ecological reproduction. And when I talk about forces of socio-ecological reproduction, yes, it marries human agency, but on the ecological side, it recognizes that, what's happening to the Earth system and how it's responding, the role of climate determinism, the stresses on ecosystems, the pressures that will come when certain zones become unlivable and animals have to move, etc. So it's from that perspective I kind of locate in the current ferment, political ferment and reimagining, sort of more than human life, or if you like, non-human animals, etc. So it's a recognition that the relationality is going to be much more accentuated in the world we are in and we're going into. Boundaries of what is human society and non-human society are going to blur, and they are already blurring. And I think that provides for a whole new way of thinking the human in the web of life.
Thanks, guys. So if we stay with, if you allow me to say non-humans in this sense, because this, you were definitely starting to get to that space of ontological ambiguity where the boundaries between what we call humans and animals or others is starting to kind of be challenged, which I definitely recognize. But if you allow me for a moment to say non-humans and mean non-human animals in this sense, do we see animals executing revolutions?
Well, I'm going to talk kind of to your issue or your idea of non-human animals acting politically. I think that's what you're trying to get at. But if we think about non-human actors, or let's just say living processes, and how they've influenced past revolutions, an interesting example potentially about humans working with natural environments within revolutions. A great example would be Haiti. The Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804. There's an author named Crystal Eddins, and she wonderfully discusses how leading up to the revolution, Saint-Domingue, that was the former name of Haiti, was a French colony, and it was producing commodities, cotton, indigo, sugarcane. And in the 17th and 18th centuries, it was very common for slaves to run away from the plantation system, and they would go to the forests and the mountains, and they would create intimate cultural knowledge with those landscapes. And this was meant as a sense of survival. And, you're establishing the centers of refuge in a way. And these really become sites of community, sites of different cosmological spaces, places of healing, places for food and medicine, and also places of resilience. And what you really see is these mountains, forests, and rivers really becoming geographies of subversion. And that's quite interesting in how these landscapes are subverting the colonial regime. The colonial landscape was very violent in the terms of oppressing the people and the landscape, and extracting the resources from the land and organizing it in a very specific way, where it's very controlled and it's very regimented. Sorry, I was thinking of the word. So it's very regimented, and having the opposite of the forest and the rivers and the land, these create rival geographies of resistance. And I think that's really important when we think about revolutions and how natural landscapes can also filter in. And not just natural landscapes, but in urban contexts too. And the Arab Spring in Cairo, a lot of people were looking towards taxi drivers to pass on information. So it's this idea of looking at geographies of subversion. And I think that's something that we can talk about in a very real way, and without anthropomorphizing the land or the animals.
Rachel, do you think it could happen the other way with non-humans appropriating or inscribing us in as part of their geography of subversions?
Ooh, that's a question that I need to think about a little bit more, Phil. So I'm going to pass on that
Throw
question
that one to
and think
Vish.
about that a little bit more. But I don't know, maybe Vish could think about that. But I mean, so I don't know if you would agree, Vish, but I think that that's a way that we should also approach this kind of living process of humans working in this kind of integrated system of radical dependencies, in a way, without putting this anthropocentric view on this topic.
Yeah, I think we agree there. I mean that we shouldn't be kind of placing whatever you want to call it, natural forces, more than human animals, etc., into a kind of prescriptive framework. There's so many things here that we got to keep in mind. I mean, ethology is the study of animal behavior, for instance, right? And that's one of the most advanced sciences we have that have tried to kind of figure things out around how animals conduct themselves, how they relate to each other, etc. But even there, we've come to very serious limits, and I think we need to keep that in mind. But I think going further, though, I think what's important for me is that even if we don't prescribe a role for nature or more than human animals, and I would argue I wouldn't want them to play a revolutionary role, but I do think that the presence of whatever you want to call these forces is becoming more poignant. It is becoming more serious. Now, I have a view that, for the past, 200,000 years of the human, we've had speciesism, this idea of killing and dominating and controlling more than human animals, etc. But it took on a more grotesque form under capitalism over the past 500 years. All the cultural limits, metaphysical thought, of ethics, of belief around more than human forms and life forms, etc., all that has been eviscerated and erased, etc., significantly, not completely, but significantly. At the same time, the technical requirements of domination and control have advanced to a mind-boggling level. I mean, we just have to look at industrial scale farming. It is a killing machine. basically, right? We kill over 100 billion aquatic life forms every year. We kill about 50 billion terrestrial life forms every year. So the speciesism has been taken to another level. Alongside this, we have extractivism, we have animal trafficking, we have this whole thing about fortress conservation, which
Mm.
also is about breeding to make money, etc., etc. We have urbanization and urban sprawl. We have climate impacts we've been talking about. I mean, all of this for me is adding up to a situation where other life forms are really facing the sixth great extinction, as I've been saying. So it's a very awful situation that we are in. The dominant system is what I would call ecocidal. It is wiping out human animals, and it is wiping out more than humans. I mean, this is the logic of the dominant system. And so, even from that standpoint, if we wanted emancipation today, we're going to have to think in more than human terms because of where the system is. The system is working with this deadly logic that is anti life. So, if we define nature as life and life processes, etc., the system we are in is anti life, basically. And so, again, those who believe there's a need to have resistance today, there's a need for struggle, etc., they're going to have a much broader conception of life in this struggle. And this is what I've been alluding to earlier on, that this will not and cannot be a human-centered struggle. It's going to have to dispose of human supremacy, this idea, this binary of humans versus nature and humans dominate nature. We're going to have to dispense with that and jettison that fundamentally, and reimagine how we confront speciesism, but how we also confront other forms of oppression, whether it's women's oppression through patriarchy, whether it's class exploitation, and whether it's racism. I mean, all these power structures and so on need to articulate with an anti-speciesism, a more emancipatory approach to more than human life. So I actually think that we are at a very interesting moment in world history where these bodies of emancipatory thought can really come together now more than ever before to upend what we've had, at least for the past 500 years, on a kind of industrial scale of ecocide. So I'm hopeful about that, in the sense that agency today can be deeply. I mean, I don't think we even have a vocabulary for this. I mean, I talk about forces of socio-ecological reproduction, but a conception of where we are no longer apex species, we are no longer the center. We are relating to other life forms in a very different way, with respect, with an ethics of care, with recognition of dependency, with the recognition of, we are also animals, etc. So, but Phil, maybe you have some thoughts on this.
I was going to ask you both the question that I get asked quite often in this space, which is Vish, pulling uh, on the argument that you were putting forward and saying, but extending um, or dissolving power amongst humans, or expanding representation, moral concern, inclusivity beyond the human, when we have deep inequality with human inclusion, let alone trying to expand it. So, should this not be human first and try and work on human emancipatory and liberatory and equality issues before we start to even get to thinking about other species? And so that's a question I get asked a lot. I'd love for you two to both see how you respond to that, Rachel.
Yeah, no, I think this is such an interesting question, and I think this is something that I'm really eager to like talk to you both about. But I think we also have to be careful with this question as well. Firstly, like, as I said before, we need to think about social justice as an environmental justice issue and environmental justice as a social justice issue. And I think we also need to acknowledge this discourse around rights and equality, and it has a long discourse and fraught discourse, particularly within Western Enlightenment and humanist frameworks, especially like during the French Revolution with the Declaration of Rights of Man, at the exclusion of women, slaves, people of color. Then in our more modern era, after World War II in 1948, you have the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which until recently has left out a whole group of people and discrimination against gender and sexuality. And a lot of scholars have argued that women's rights are not kind of put to the fore in that document. So trans species rights, I think, cannot precede or exclude the rights of people who have been historically marginalized and who still actually do not have those rights recognized. So when we think about Vish's work on the coloniality of the planetary crisis, or Judith Butler's work on how different systems of violence make a distinction between people and environments whose lives are worth safeguarding versus those who are not, I think we need to kind of realize this idea that all life is valuable, non-human and human, are all of it is valuable. And again, it's this idea of radical equality that Judith Butler talks about in The Force of Nonviolence. And I think that's kind of where we need to acknowledge that our lives depend on their lives depend on ours. We're in this together on a very fragile and damaged planet, but we need to recognize that in order to thrive.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Rachel. Fish.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that, we need to recognize that this is not an either or not, if you like.
Yeah.
And that both these dynamics, whether it's inequality and human exclusion, and on the other hand, speciesism, which is what I've been calling it, these two things are basically interconnected, okay? And this is the paradigm shift I've been arguing for. We need to recognize, as Rachel says, we are dependent on Earth relations, and we're killing the damn Earth, okay? And so, we've got to address Earth relations while at the same time, we've got to restore Earth relations, while at the same time, we've got to stop the harms, okay, putting it simply. If we stay in this frame of, human emancipation first, and then something, emancipation for others later, you'll end up in a problematic place like we have in South Africa. In South Africa, notions of revolution, there's a lot of nuance to it. But in the end, the schema that has been used is what is called a two-stage theory of revolution in South Africa. And it's amounted to what is called the bourgeois revolution first. So you deracialize capitalism, you create a few black elites, etc., etc. And then, of course, you work towards a socialist revolution. And again, this is part of the inheritance of a very bankrupt Marxism, Leninism, and jaded. And it hasn't worked. I mean, in the sense that, right now, even our so-called black capitalists are not good capitalists. Our state is not a good capitalist state. It is failing. It's falling apart. It's criminalized, etc., etc. It's caught up in in deep historical processes, actually. So I think what I'm getting at is that conception of like framing a hierarchy, sort of gymnastics of oppression, is not the way to go, given where we are today. I consider myself a democratic eco-socialist. What that means for this conversation, which I think is very important, is in terms of democracy, I believe in deep democracy, not narrow electoral politics, okay? So deep democracy will embrace electoral politics, will embrace democratic rights and freedoms, But it'll go further in terms of participation, in terms of direct democracy, and so on. So, things like commons and the commoning. How does a community handle a river? How does it manage a forest, etc.? That's deep democracy. It's ecological because it is based on a critique of domination ecology. You see, the speciesism I've been talking about, this killing and control and exploitation of more than human life, etc. This is part of domination ecology, and it's been in the making for 500 years. And so as an eco-socialist, for me, it's important to critique domination ecology. This is where that decentering beyond human supremacy is so important. And there are different approaches to this critique, and indigenous ecology does provide very powerful critique that we can learn from. For instance, eco-anarchists, in my case, I'll draw on decolonial ecological Marxism to make this critique, etc. But there's something else about the ecological that's very important, and that is that we've got to think about it in expansive terms, okay? And this is where earth relations becomes absolutely important. And this notion of earth justice becomes absolutely crucial. And so, it's and Rachel, this is, for me, it's not just about environmental justice, it's social justice. There's something deeper that we have to embrace around our positioning and our relationship to the earth. And I think earth justice is very crucial in the ecological, in the socialism. I think the other point is feminism, an ecological feminism, and that's very powerful in terms of, again, confronting structures of power that dominate women, patriarchal structures of power, chauvinistic structures of power, etc. And then, of course, it's socialist because we have to have needs, the needs of society also at the center of this process. So what I've just described right now is an ideology that's in the making, in the context of the cycles of resistance today, that is being shaped by different praxis-centered modes of emancipatory thought. And it's trying to have a much more, I would argue, broader conception of emancipation at its core. And it's definitely not anthropocentric. It's definitely not just human-centered, but it's recognizing it's not either or.
I'm just tracking time, folks. This is such an important conversation, and I'm really glad we're surfacing it. So I'm going to somewhat jarringly jolt us into the kind of so what and what next kind of aspect of this. So, what do you think are some of the maybe methodological or indeed operational and tactical innovations that we need if we take the point, which I think you're both broadly making, which is we need some form of kind of ecological revolution in the way maybe Vish as you just described. So I'm just really interested. I'm on board with your argument. How do I go out and do it tomorrow? And maybe if you could kind of talk at different scales of that, how does that look and play out at a local scale? How does it work at a national scale? Even if is national the right scale? Is this a kind of global move? And if it's a global movement, then how do we decentralize it? All of those kind of issues. Give me your best innovations and tools to start this revolution.
Rachel, you want to go?
Sure. I mean, well, in terms of activism, not everybody has the same level of activism. Some people are privileged enough to go to protests, some people are not. And so it really depends on what kind of forms of activism that you want to take. And it could be going to a protest, it could be to little acts of resistance, supporting local food sovereignty like Vish does. And, it can have a myriad of ways in which it's realized. So that's important to realize when we talk about what does activism mean. Well, I guess, we've kind of hinted at like different laws, the rights of rivers, rights of land. Well, in 2021, a concrete example potentially we could talk about is the idea of ecocide that has been created by a panel of criminal and environmental lawyers who are really trying to push for the criminalization and mass destruction of ecosystems. I have like the definition here. It's the unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. So I think one way we can talk about this in a concrete way is how do we enforce laws? How do we reform laws so we can uphold accountability for corporations, for governments, and things like this? So, I think that's one step in the right direction. I think that's a tangible way that we can start approaching this idea. But there's more that can be done. And again, as I said, like on different scales, it could be joining your mutual aid group. It could be, as I said before, working with like food sovereignty. So there's all these types of little acts of resistance against our regime of status quo, which is, globalized capitalism. So how do we erode that, as Vish says, and tame it and exit capitalism, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, to build on that, so I really think that we got to think about the narrative very carefully, the nature of this crisis. We throw out this word polycrisis in sort of systemic, risk assessment and response and so on. But actually, if you boil it down, it's about the crisis of life. That's what we're dealing with at the level of narrative. And it's not just human life. It's all forms of life that are in crisis. We've been talking about this ecocidal logic of the system. It's mass killing of everything that's underway, okay? So I think we got to get that narrative right. We got to get that narrative to resonate, this crisis of life, and how do we find exits from this that speaks to, the life needs of all life forms. We are part of an organic whole, a living planetary system. So that's my first point. My second point is to kind of think about the most decisive strategic entry point into this crisis of life. And I would argue it is the climate crisis, and that's where my activism is. And we don't just understand climate justice as an ethical critique, as an ethical positioning. It's important, and we embrace that. We don't just understand climate justice as a critique of fossil fuel capitalism or the polycrisis. We embrace all of that. But we also understand climate justice as a political project. And this is what's important. And so the charter we took to our parliament in South Africa has a plurivision, vision to address the legacies of apartheid, to confront the polycrisis of the present, and secure a livable, just, and democratic future. So out of that kind of building this vision and kind of trying to kind of elaborate this politics, we've reached a point where we are now translating the 14 alternatives in the charter into a national toolbox for communities, for workplaces, etc., to kind of work with what Rachel is saying, work on food sovereignty, work on rights of nature, and particularly biodiversity registers in communities, etc., to keep ecosystems resilient and things like that. An ecocide law that she mentioned, we're working on one of those, which we'll also take to our parliament soon. Water commoning and thinking about rivers as crucial for life, etc. All of this is coming together in our national toolbox. At the same time, we are talking about a climate emergency social contract for the country. And we are saying we need a national framework. We need a big idea that can accelerate this transition, that can get all the socio-ecological forces of reproduction in society to work together, okay? And to have the necessary conversations, to have the hard dialogues, and to reposition where we're taking our country. So these are some of the ideas that we are working on. There's a lot of resonance with what Rachel is saying as well. But as I said, we've tried to crystallize this now into a politics of our time. And of course, democratic systemic reforms become central because you want to stop this logic of killing everything, right? You want to erode the system, you want to tame the system, and you want to go beyond the system. And this is what we call transformative praxis that we are busy with in South Africa at different scales.
Thanks, both. We're all of us on this call deeply interested and invested in this idea of systemic risk, and we've had a very particular conversation today about voicing and bringing to the forefront our non-human kin in all of their complexity, both as life process in a more ecological vision and also kind of distinctly as individuals, and not having prejudice against them because they are of a particular species, which would be the notion of speciesism, which you introduced, Vish. What's at stake here? Do you think that systemic risk as a field has to have this as as a fundamental assumption about how it kind of views the world and the revolutions or the systems transformations that are needed? Because there would be some that would that aren't arguing for this, that are arguing that we actually just need improvements to our existing institutions, or that we might be able to get around it in some other way, which isn't explicitly acknowledging what you both have kind of articulated today. So, what's at stake here? Is this something that you think the field needs to really kind of address? And if so, what do we need to do in that regard?
Yeah, I think that sometimes, like all disciplines, we all have our pitfalls. Sometimes I think that, in my opinion, systemic risk can sometimes be too narrow in terms of thinking about temporalities. That's something that I'm really interested in, is like, how do we look at different temporalities? And I think also, Phil, you talked about that in your article that you are putting out, about how do we kind of put in new temporalities to think about systemic risk. Yeah, I think that we need to, again, decenter and not have such rigid kind of siloed ways of thinking that sometimes can happen within systemic risk. It reminds me actually a little bit of Beth Dempster's and Donna Haraway's talking about sympoetic systems, where you need to have systems that really kind of do not have these rigid spatial temporal bounds, and that are highly adaptable. Information is distributed like amongst the different components, whereas this is the antithesis is autopoietic systems, where it's more highly individualized, it's less adaptive. So we need to think about this kind of collective collaborations and collective forces, and not be so rigid with our terminologies, and having these dialogues again with different different experts in different fields. So I think this is something that needs to be eroded as we go forward.
Thanks, Rachel. Awesome. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I agree with Rachel, and we also got to go further and actually put out a critique of speciesism and how it's linked to the sixth mass extinction and so on that's going on, and build from there. I think in terms of how we think about socio-ecological systems or the social earth system. So we need a discursive shift as well. I mean, there's a lot of work that's been done around socio-ecological systems, so we don't just think in narrow human-centric terms. But yeah, I think we're on the same page.
I think one thing that I think we should talk about is how our current definition of revolution is not necessarily fit for our 21st century. One of the current definitions is the forceful overthrow of it's the forceful overthrow of government through mass mobilization in the name of social justice to create new political institutions. I think maybe Vish would agree with me that we're not necessarily just dealing with governments anymore. We're dealing with financial institutions. We are dealing with transnational corporations. We're dealing with monopolies, and this kind of is our current definition is not really adequate to what we're facing. Again, it's the extractivist practices, this that's really not sustainable for our life. And again, it's about, radically imagining a new future through different practices that Vish talks about, but also through experimental risk, as I said earlier. So I think we need to think more broadly about this topic. What does revolution mean in our polycrisis?
When you start from a non-human perspective, when you start to kind of take the lions in negotiation with the African dogs for territory as really serious in terms of a social process there, and another way of living and another way of being, which has sustained over hundreds of thousands of generations, far beyond human timeframes, and really think about what are the institutions, what's the role of an institution in that? Why don't we see institutions forming in what we might call nature? Where are the river institutions and rules and regulations that bound them? And then this kind of question of dominance, I think, is got a long way to kind of go when we start to think about issues of violence and just sheer physicality, and how animals negotiate through acts of deterrence, which does have a kind of hard power component to it. I'm bigger, stronger than you. If I can communicate to you, then maybe we can come to some arrangement. There's so much depth that we need to kind of really think about here. So I'm just really grateful that you joined this conversation, that we could get this just out and get people kind of thinking about these big changes maybe might be a little bit more than just big changes to kind of how we all see it at the moment. So I'm just super grateful to you both.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you so much, and I really appreciate it. And it was just lovely to hear both of you talk, and also help me think through a lot of issues that were addressed today. So I appreciate it.